Hey guys, today we're going to take a look at, or should I say, today and tomorrow, we're going to take a look at the Compromise of 1850, the five provisions that go inside of that, as well as the start of the crisis of the Union leading up to Civil War. Uh, so today we're going to just do the beginnings, go over the five provisions of the Compromise of 1850, and then start the crisis of the Union. Right. So, Compromise of 1850 um, basically was the compromise that came out of what was going to be done with the Mexican cession. If you remember from the reading, the critical reading, the Mexican American War, America swept Mexico and therefore was granted by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo all of that land in the Mexican cession. And of course, the crown jewel in all of that land was, of course, California. California was a mammothly large state at this point in time, the biggest in the Union. Um, and it was chock full of natural resources. San Francisco Bay and the harbor there, shipping could get going in and out there. The fertile Silicon Valley, what we know today as the Silicon Valley, where all the computer chip manufacturing takes place at, that was fertile farm ground, incredibly fertile farm ground. And that one thing I don't think a lot of people understand about California when they hear California, they think L.A., San Francisco, San Diego, the coast, the Pacific Ocean. Um, a lot of California is actually farmland. Some of the best vineyards in America are there in the Sonoma Valley. So wineries are there. Food is there. Dairy farming's there. Cattle production is there. There is a lot of farming that takes place in the eastern part of the state, up near the Rocky Mountains and the Sierra Nevadas. So California, with all that being said, California was a very, very interesting prospect for farming. And if we know one thing about farming, Southerners farmed, thanks in part to slavery. And so California really becomes the crucial crutch of this compromise, but Californians also have a say in it as well too. So here are the five provisions of the Compromise of 1850. The first one is California, when she was the Bear Flag Republic for all of about 3 months, her own independent country, and then of course she is annexed by the United States. California, the people that are living there go ahead and write their own state constitution in which they outlaw slavery. Now, this didn't sit well with Southerners. And the Southerners, of course, wanted the federal government to come in and do something about that. But as we'll get to here in a little bit, this idea of popular sovereignty uh, was really taking hold in the late 1840s and the early 1850s, and where the people of the state will get to choose what they want. And so California writes a baseline state constitution in which it outlaws slavery. And so when she gets ready to come in for statehood, they go ahead and say, okay, the people of California would like to be a non slave state. So we're going to grant her that. Well, Southerners were outraged at this. There's no way that Southerners are going to let the largest state coming into the Union be a free state and tip the balance of power. Now, at this point in time in 1850, there's not another chunk of land that can be made a state to equal out the balance. So, to get Southerners to jump on board with California being a free state and to get them to vote on it, Northerners would have to give something to Southerners. And that was going to be the second point, which would be a stronger fugitive slave law. Now, there had been other fugitive slave law acts that had been passed by Congress throughout the 1840s, but many northern states didn't really listen to them. The big thing with this was Virginia, Kentucky, Delaware, Maryland. These states really wanted the stronger fugitive slave law act in place because, of course, their states are right next, right, to free states, right? And so they want to make sure that the federal government was going to do something about this. And these previous fugitive slave law acts that have been passed throughout the 1840s really left it upon the states to take care of it. That it was the states' responsibility to enforce these fugitive slave laws. So, for example, if a runaway slave from Tennessee ran up to, say, northern Ohio, it was upon the Ohio government to go ahead and allow bounty hunters from Tennessee to come up and find the fugitive slave and bring them back to Tennessee. Right? Uh, and most of the time, northern states wouldn't allow the bounty hunters into the state. They'd say, "No, we don't allow slavery in our states, so no, you can't come up here." And so Southerners really wanted, especially the northern Southern states, wanted a stronger fugitive slave law that was passed by Congress and would be enforced by the federal government. Northerners didn't really like this too much, but if Northerners wanted California to pass as a free state, they knew they had to give something to Southern states to get the vote. And so they go ahead and make this the second point of the Compromise of 1850. The third part of the Compromise of 1850, and in my opinion, is kind of the death knell of the whole compromising situation. This is actually what will drive us to war. And one of the most controversial pieces of legislation that's going to be passed in 1854, and that is the Kansas-Nebraska Act. It's all based upon this idea of popular sovereignty. Right? Sovereignty, all that means is where the power resides. And so the power resides in the popular, it resides in the people of the state. And so this idea comes sweeping across that the federal government really shouldn't get involved in telling people what states can and cannot be. How about we let the people of the states choose and decide whether they want slavery or not? And so this becomes a really, really, really popular idea, like I said, in the late 1840s and throughout the 1850s. And so the third point of this Compromise of 1850 is going to be popular sovereignty. From here on out, the government isn't going to decide for the people whether the state's going to be free or slave. The people are going to choose that, which I don't know about you, but when you let people try to decide what's best for them, it creates arguments. I mean, we're going through it right now in this whole COVID-19 situation here in the state of North Carolina. If you recall or have heard last week, there were people who marched on Raleigh to beg the governor to reopen the state because of his mandates of stay at home, which have been extended to May 8th. And so people are upset about that. They want to open the state back up. They want some jobs to be opened back up, and I mean, who could blame them? Some of the people there probably they lost their jobs. But on the other side of that, I mean, we're in the midst of a pandemic of a disease that we don't have any real treatment for or cures for. So on the other side of that, you got people who are calling them out for being idiots, and I bet they're the ones that are about to get sick. And so you have division. And the only thing really that's stopping that division from really getting a hold on it, of course, is the government, state of North Carolina, the General Assembly, and the governor. They're stopping that from division really coming in way. Now, imagine that same argument between those that say we should open the state back up and those that say we should stay at home and keep the order in place. Imagine if there was no Governor Cooper. Imagine if there were no police. Imagine if there was no General Assembly and that the people, the two factions, the side that say open the state back up and the side that says no, stay sheltered in place. Imagine if it was those two going at it, right? I'm sure there would be a lot of tensions. Now, I wouldn't think it'd come to blows like it did in 1854, but it probably wouldn't be that that nice out there. And so the government really is the one that kind of manages. They're the referee of the bunch. But this idea in the late 1840s and early 1850s was this idea of popular sovereignty. Let the people choose if they want to allow slavery out there. The federal government should not get in the way, right, of deciding what should happen out there. So that's the third point. The fourth point was cash for land. Texas was in debt uh, due to her time as an independent country for those short few years that she was an independent country, and then having to fight a revolution war. They were in debt, and so they owed money to the federal government. They owed money to other countries as well. And they were about to go belly up and couldn't pay these. And so, what they went ahead and did was they ceded their Western territory in return from $10 million from the federal government, and that was to pay off the war debts. So that's point four. And then, of course, the fifth point of the Compromise of 1850 was to go ahead and abolish slave trade in Washington, D.C. Now, notice I did not type abolish slavery in the nation's capital. It was just to abolish slave trade in the nation's capital. Right. So if we look at this, there's 5 points in the Missouri Compromise of 1850. For the North, they get California. California comes in as a free state. For the South, they get a federally mandated stronger Fugitive Slave Law Act to deal with the New Mexico Territory and the Mexican Cession. Popular sovereignty will be introduced to that. Let the settlers decide what they want their territory to become, slave or free, and the federal government stay the heck out. The fourth point, the federal assumption of Texas debt, and Texas goes ahead and cedes its western lands, which I'll show you on the map here in a second, the land they gave away. And then, of course, slavery in Washington, D.C., they go ahead and they abolish the slave trade in Washington, D.C. So before, you see, Texas used to be all of this. All of that was Texas. And then after the Compromise of 1850, Texas cedes this chunk of land right through here, all right, for $10 million to the federal government to pay off war debt. All right, so you get the unorganized territory, the Utah territory, the New Mexico territory. There's California as a state. And then you notice this little chunk of land right there. That's the good old Gadsden Purchase, which we'll get to with 1854. Right. All right. So the great triumvirate of the antebellum Senate at this point in time was Daniel Webster, Henry Clay, and John C. Calhoun. Now you can see Daniel Webster and Henry Clay are both for the Compromise of 1850, and of course the South Carolina Senator John C. Calhoun was totally against the Compromise of 1850. But there he is, Henry Clay. At this point in time, he is an old man by 1850. If you remember, he has been in the political scene since about 1812. He was one of the first war hawks that came up. So we're talking about close to 30 plus years. This man has been serving in the Senate. And so this portrait right here is called the Great Compromiser at Work One Last Time, because eventually he will pass away. Now, one thing about this bill, it would have been incredibly difficult, all right, if you would have taken all 5 points of the Compromise of 1850 and put them in one piece of legislation and then sent that to the House and the Senate to be pushed on to the president and voted for. You would not have gotten the majority, particularly from the Southerners. The Southerners would have rejected this whole bill in general, through and through, and some Northerners would have rejected the premise of the popular sovereignty. But what Stephen Douglas does, the Democrat from Illinois, he designed the compromise as a whole. Although Clay takes credit for it, it was really Stephen Douglas and the genius behind this idea. Instead of making it one big bill, he puts the bill into five different phases. Right, so he separates the bill, each with different majorities to pass. And therefore, all five parts of the bill will pass. Right, so the crisis is averted. Right, of what do we do with all this free land that we just got from the Mexican American War? The crisis has been inverted. We've now figured out what we're going to do with this Mexican cession. That is for now. The Compromise of 1850 starts this ticking time bomb that really gets this war going. I mean, in 1850, we're shaking hands, we're agreeing to it. There are parts of it we like, there are parts of it we don't like, but at least we shook hands on it. And by 1860, we are going to be shooting one another. And so let's now just move and jump into there we go, the actual crisis of the Union and get to a certain point in that. Okay. All right. The crisis of the Union, 1850 to 1860. Again, the Compromise of 1850. Oops, go back. For the North, right, admit California as a free state. For the South, a stronger fugitive slave law. The New Mexico Territory, popular sovereignty. In the Mexican Cession, this is key right here, popular sovereignty, the idea that people get to choose whether their state's going to be slave or free. Texas sells its land and the federal government assumes Texas's state debts, and then abolish slave trade in Washington, D.C. And so the crisis is averted. We shake hands in 1850, and by 1860, right, were shooting one another. Right? The Compromise of 1850 was supposed to be the final compromise between the sections, and it was, just for different reasons than Clay, who took credit for this compromise, had intended the compromise to be. Now, what starts our downward spiral to war? Well, the very first thing, it has to do with that second point of the Compromise of 1850, which was a federally mandated stronger fugitive slave law. Right? Like I said, prior to 1850, right, the states had to determine how they were going to figure out fugitive slave law acts. Right? So, like I said, if a slave ran away, say from Tennessee, and got up into northern Ohio, Tennessee would send bounty hunters or bounty collectors, right, up to Ohio to find, quote unquote, the piece of property. Right? Ohio could reject them if they wanted. I mean, so basically, Southerners were pretty upset at the fact that Northern states didn't have to follow their fugitive slave laws. So, of course, they wanted was the federal government to come in and make laws against for this fugitive slave law, and that's exactly what they did with that second point there in the Compromise of 1850. But even then, Northern states still didn't accept this, right? And these are simply known as personal liberty laws. States such as Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa passed these personal liberty laws. And basically, what they did was they guaranteed jury trials for accused slaves, which totally went against, right, the Compromise of 1850 and that second point of a federally mandated stronger Fugitive Slave Law Act. Basically, northern states are putting a big middle finger up to the federal government saying, no, we're not going to send these slaves back unless they get a jury trial. And this outraged southern states. Southern states were looking to the federal government saying, aren't you going to do anything about these northern states who are completely disregarding the law? And which the federal government doesn't really do anything about it. In fact, we just call this de facto nullification. The northern states are basically nullifying a piece of federal legislation. They're saying, no, we're not going to adhere to it. We're not just going to send runaway slaves back into bondage. We're not going to do that unless they get a jury trial. And then the book that shocks the nation. All right. And you're going to watch a little video on this one right here and answer some questions. But this book right here utterly rocked the nation. It was wrote by Harriet Beecher Stowe. If you remember back to the Second Great Awakening from when we started e-learning, um, this is the daughter of Lyman Beecher. All right. Lyman Beecher was one of the pastors that was accredited with kind of spurring on the Second Great Awakening. His daughter here, Harriet Beecher, and then when she gets married, she takes, of course, that name, Harriet Beecher Stowe. All right. She ends up writing this book in 1852 called Uncle Tom's Cabin. And it utterly rocked the nation. It became a best-selling novel. In fact, printing presses couldn't even keep up with the demand for people wanting to read this book, or The Life Among the Lowly. It's Uncle Tom's Cabin, or otherwise known as Life Among the Lowly. And she really showed the horrors of slavery. And her big thing that she did in this book, and so important, is that she brought the human element into it. Okay, prior to 1852, people knew slavery was bad, and of course, the abolitionists had been clamoring since the 1830s that they wanted to do away with slavery. But one thing that the common man in America and the common woman in America had yet to really been described about slavery, particularly if you lived in the North, was this human element to it. If you vert back to the Second Great Awakening, when this religious revival swept across America, the big thing about it was that it was trying to get to an emotional response to people. It was trying to touch the inner chords of people, not with just facts, but it was trying to tug at your heart a little bit. And, Harriet Beecher right here, the daughter of Lyman Beecher, the aforementioned pastor that was accredited as being one of the founders of the Second Great Awakening, took what her father had done as far as trying to touch the heart chords of people during this religious revival, and she used this in her book. Right? This book was going to touch people in a way that had never been touched. They saw the raw human emotion of slavery. Um, If you've never read this book, and of course we've got plenty of time because of school being canceled now for the rest of the year. If you've never read Uncle Tom's Cabin, I highly suggest that you do. The scene or the scene you get in your head when Liza crosses the river to escape the bounty hunters with her child. If it doesn't pull on your strings just a little bit and get you thinking, well, I mean, for my sense, I read this book when I was in college, and it's still one of my favorite books. And that scene, that vivid scene, that imagery I get when Liza has to cross the river, to get to freedom, is just one of the most boom hit you in the face moments of the pure human element and the human spirit. And so this book really, really tugs at the strings of people. In fact, um, Queen Elizabeth will actually say, or is it Queen Victoria? Queen Victoria, Queen Elizabeth in England actually will say that she wept to her knees, crying after she finished this book. What this book did was open up the eyes of people to the human element of slavery and the horrors that came with slavery. And if you couldn't read, so therefore, if you couldn't read this book, um, they came out with a picture story of it and a play as well too. So you could read the cartoon or you could go and watch the play. And so the play and these pictures showed the human element. And of course, the main characters of it, Legree, who is the overseer. There's Liza and her baby, and then of course Uncle Tom, who the book is named after. Which it's funny and interesting because Uncle Tom actually was a fugitive slave that knocked on Harriet Beecher Stowe, and she took him in, and so she kind of based this book upon his experience, and then she added some other things to it. Right? And just like the Twilight, ha ha ha, some books make us rethink. Right? Twilight made us rethink about what we think about vampires. Not all vampires are just blood sucking creatures that they actually can love. And, like Twilight did, haha, no, okay. Uh, some books make us rethink. Twilight made some people rethink about vampires. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom Cabin made us rethink about slavery. And mm, no longer was slavery just a business thing. Now it became a human element thing. It was human beings are involved with this. Big, huge, important book that was written. I now in the 1852 presidential election, Democrat William Pierce, of course, sweeps the Whig Winfield Scott and just sweeps the election, all right, and gets into office. Now, Franklin Pierce, 14th President of the United States, also known as Handsome Frank, Mexican War veteran. The big thing and why I put him in here is because he is the president that signs into law the Kansas Nebraska Act. And if there's one piece of legislation that leads us to war, it is that Kansas Nebraska Act. Um, Northerners will call him a dough face because his face is malleable because he's pro-Southern, and he is not renominated. So he just serves one term as president, and he says, as a famous quote, when he realizes he's not going to get reelected, well, there's nothing left to do but to get drunk. Right? And so basically, this is how Northerners felt and Westerners felt the federal government was attempting to do to them. They were forcing slavery down the throat of a free soiler. Now, at this point in time, there were a couple political factions that were developing. Of course, you had the Democratic Party, the party of Andrew Jackson, very entrenched in the South, and there was even, of course, Northern Democrats. The second party you had were the Whigs. The Whigs were the former party of the Federalists. The Federalists had collapsed, and the Whigs had taken their place. And the Whigs are kind of teeter tottering as well too, because of this faction right here, the Free Soilers. Now, Free Soilers are not abolitionists. That was another faction as well. Free Soilers are Westerners who do not want slavery expanding out westward, say to Iowa, Minnesota, the Kansas Territory, the Nebraska Territory. They believe that that land is solely for white people. I always like to give a description of the way free soilers believed like this. Imagine a pristine piece of grass in a front yard, like my father. My dad is so uh, particular about his lawn. Like he's only got to have a certain type of seed. Um, he mows it like 3 times a week, whether or not the blades of the mower are actually cutting any grass. He just gets enjoyment at the lines going through the yard, and the grass like is thick and it's just beautiful. And currently, right now, we were just over there a couple days ago, um, and it was just gorgeous, right? And of course, my dog Callie, she just starts running right out there. Uh, to her, it's like grass. Let's play. Let's run. And of course, she just runs around, and she stops and she decides to go to the bathroom right there. She takes a number two. Um, and she takes a number two on my dad's grass. And my dad just was like, "Dang it, Drew, your dog pooped on my grass. Go get it. Here's a bag. You need to go pick that up. Don't let that sit here." And so within like 30 seconds of my dog going to the bathroom, my dad was already like, "You got to get that dog turd off my grass." Think of it like this: free soilers, that dog turd represents slavery on a beautiful piece of grass. And they do not want that dog turd on that piece of grass. So get it removed as quickly as you can and keep that pristine grass as pristine as possible. Free soilers, again, are not abolitionists, but they do not want slavery expanding. And so they become a political faction. And so basically, what's about to happen here in the early 1850s, by 1856, is the Whig Party will cease to exist and a new party will come in its place. And the new party will be the Republican Party, what we know today as the Republican Party. The Republican Party will have a coalition of abolitionists, former Northern Whigs, and Free Soilers. These three together, these three groups of people will make up the Republican Party. And then the final piece that we're going to talk about is the most dreaded piece of legislation ever passed. And it was simply known as the Kansas Nebraska Act of 1854. Senator Stephen Douglas from Illinois, all right, right here, wanted to have a railroad, all right, that went through the territories to get down through that Mexican cession, what we are going to know as the Gadsden Purchase, to get out to California. But you can't just put a railroad through territory. You got to have people living out there to maintain the railroad. But instead of having this furious debate in Washington about whether this area should be slave or free, this should be slave or free, that idea from the third point of the Compromise of 1850 roots its head. This idea of popular sovereignty. Let the people choose what they want the territory to be. Right. And so the Kansas Nebraska Act went ahead and opened up these two territories, Nebraska Territory and Kansas Territory, to the idea of popular sovereignty. And in Kansas and Nebraska Territory, on the issue of slavery, it was going to be determined upon the people living there. And so basically, what this act does was struck through the Missouri Compromise. Because if you remember the Missouri Compromise of 1820, Missouri becomes a slave state. 3630 line, there is to be no slavery north of that. Well, according to the Kansas Nebraska Act, it opens this up to slavery. And not only does this open it up to slavery, it opens up the Utah territory to slavery, the Oregon territory. It opens up all of this territory up here to the possibility of slavery. And this alarms Northerners. And so, what happens once they pass this Kansas Nebraska Act in 1854, people rush out to Kansas. Pro slavery and anti slavery people flood Kansas. Of course, you've got the border ruffians from Missouri who were coming over. And they would elicit a tax and they would just get in to vote. And then once the vote took place about what was going to happen in Kansas, they would leave and go back to Missouri. That basically voter fraud they were trying to commit there. And then you had the New England Immigrant Aid Society, which actually come to find out Harriet Beecher Stowe's brother, right, and Lyman Beecher's son, William Beecher, he creates this New England Immigrant Aid Society and gets a thousand plus people to move out to the Kansas territory so that they can stop the border ruffians. And they simply just become known as Beecher's Bibles. And there is Henry Ward Beecher, all right, otherwise known as William, all right. He creates this New England Immigrant Aid Society, and from an excerpt from the New York Tribune right here, Henry W. Beecher, believed that the Sharps rifle was a truly moral agency, and that there was more moral power in one of those instruments, so far as the slaveholders of Kansas were concerned, than in 100 Bibles. You might just as well read the Bible to buffaloes as to pro-slavery settlers, but they have a supreme respect for the logic that is embodied in the Sharps rifle. That became his Bible. No, they didn't go down there and throw Bibles at people. They went down there and shot bullets at people. And so Kansas erupts into what simply becomes known as Bleeding Kansas. It's actually the first deaths of the Civil War. The first thing that the pro-slavery element of the Border Ruffians do is they sack the anti-slavery capital of the Kansas Territory, Lawrence. Right? Because of this, this enters into this figure, very, very prominent figure. You're going to do a little activity on him. His name is John Brown, and he is an abolitionist, a failure at everything he did in life. He failed at two marriages, he failed in three businesses, he was in debt up to his eyeball, and he was sitting in a church in up north, and a preacher was giving a sermon on the horrors of slavery. John Brown calls it his divine spirit, like it hit him right then and there. And he stood up in the church and he said, I, John Brown, now know that slavery is the scourge of this earth, and I will do everything in my power to eradicate it. And so he and his sons go ahead and pick up and they head down to Kansas. And at Pottawatomie Creek, him and his sons hacked to death with broadswords five pro Southern border ruffians. Um, and he kind of becomes this like figure. Now we ain't done with John Brown. John Brown will also do some more stuff, but we introduce him here in Kansas. And of course, there is John Stewart Curry's The Tragic Prelude to Civil War. And notice who's right in the middle of it with, Beecher's Bible, the Sharp's rifle, and the Bible, Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. And in the middle of it, between the North and the South, of course, is John Brown. He's kind of the spark of the Civil War. Right. Then what happens, of course, is the conflicting constitutions. All right. You had the Topeka Constitution that got pushed in, which was going to be anti slavery. And then you had the Lee Compton Constitution that came in, which would be pro slavery. And then because of the Kansas Nebraska Act, and then because of Bleeding Kansas, we see the birth of the Republican Party, which started in 1854. It included Northern Whigs and Northern Free Soil Democrats. Again, Free Soilists are not abolitionists, although they support the Republican Party, and New England and the Northwest is the Republican Party's power base. Now, we'll stop there for today, and then in uh, Wednesday, Thursday's lessons, we'll jump right into the war actually getting ready to get started. I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you guys are doing well, and I'll talk to you later.